The first tip your fellow players have given you on playing against the storm is from Griswold 7 Slicer, and it is about settler resolve and forest hostility. As you know, if your forest hostility level is high during a storm period, additional negative effects are activated which can have very bad consequences for settlers. And since this is especially true on higher difficulty levels, Griswold 7 Slicer's tip for you is to make sure to reduce the forest hostility during a storm season by removing settlers from woodcutters' workplaces. Use them instead to build more homes for new settlers arriving during drizzle season, or roads to connect more resources and buildings to your settlement. Second part of his advice about keeping resolve high is about upgrading your settlement level at the ancient heart to the encampment status. If you do this before the first storm season starts, you will gain a boost of 2 resolve points and avoid a harsh drop in settlers' resolve, which is already low at the start of any new settlement. Another player suggested about the same tips, so I thank you, Fregor, and want to add that he points out that 4 homes should be your priority to build after the woodcutters camps, which I totally agree with, since these are prerequisites for upgrading the settlement level at your ancient heart. He also added several other tips, like not rushing with choosing your orders until you have weathered the first storm season, completed your first year, and opened the new cornerstones to see what is offered. Then you should cross-check these with the offered orders and events in the first small glade to pick the easiest orders you can fulfill, but which will get you the best rewards for your current situation. I have talked about these topics myself in my How to Start guide on Against the Storm, which you can find linked up here on the right and down below in the description. More simple advice from Griswold 7 Slicer is to make sure you have stockpiled some coal, tools and sea marrow before you open up any forbidden or dangerous glades, as events in these often require those resources to be solved. A way to get resources you might be lacking for solving glade events is to build a trade post before opening these glades so that you can trade for the required resources and avoid any negative consequences that await you after event timers run out. Griswold 7 Slicer continues his advice with the one about making sure to use your first few building blueprints to unlock at least one complex food building. I do agree, and this is something I myself do most of the time, but with an important caveat. You should keep track of your orders and available resources before choosing the blueprints. If you do not have the required resources at hand for that complex food, or if you have a difficult order, it is better to skip the complex food building in the first 3 blueprint unlocks, finish those orders, and use the next blueprint unlocks to get a building for making complex food. The last tip from Griswold 7 Slicer I would like to talk about is the one where he disagrees with my own advice about saving up and using your sea marrow for speeding up event resolution in glades, which I told you about in my previous list of tips for playing against the storm, linked up here and below. He considers them much more valuable as a trade good, which can even be worth a new cornerstone choice if a trader comes with this offer and you have unlocked the required prerequisites in the Smoldering City. To me, this is a big gamble, as traders always have different goods and bonuses on offer, and some events can be devastating if not finished quickly. That doesn't mean you can't sell any, ever, but you should weigh your options with care. A simple yet useful piece of advice from Stelu Hututui is about the slow process of upgrading the Smoldering City. This is because if you mostly play on a lower difficulty, you get fewer resources for upgrading and unlocking main city buildings. So his tip for you is to increase the difficulty setting when preparing to start a new settlement as a way to get more resources after successfully completing it. DERP Master also has some advice for you about the game's difficulty. As he points out, you might get the idea to increase the difficulty after you have upgraded past the first few levels of the Smoldering City and gotten some bonuses and upgrades. This, however, will not help you much if you still haven't mastered the settler game mechanics and in-game economy, since these are the most crucial aspects of the game. I have actually shown you the best starting upgrades to take in the Smoldering City in a previous video full of tips I mentioned before, and which is linked in the playlist up here on the right and down below in the description. And I agree with DERP Master here that these upgrades will not help you in higher difficulty levels until you have learned the intricacies of gameplay in Against the Storm, which is exactly what these videos of mine are for. So feel free to share your own tips and I will include them in future videos. CetraProfessor has an interesting tip about setting up homes and decorations while conserving space and upgrading the settlement level at the same time. This ties directly into the advice from Griswold 7 Slicer and Fregor and looks something like this, which CetraProfessor called the Park Candy Corner. I personally love it, and it is both simple and cheap to construct, as you need that one park decoration, which counts as 4 decoration points and fills the requirement for decorations by itself for the first settlement level upgrade, which I talked about in the first tip. A very good tip from Minestar 2000, whose other tips I have talked about in my previous video, is about resource scarcity in different biomes. Like how in the mushroom realm of marshlands, it is rare to find farmable land, and so it is hard to have a good supply of grain which you need for flour. Fortunately, this biome has ample sources of mushrooms, which can be ground into flour as well, just by changing the input resources using the recipe menu in the building you're using for flour production. Another player whose tips I have mentioned in my previous video is Paul R. One of his extra tips is about choosing harpies as settlers in caravans used to start a new settlement. This is because of their huge carry bonus when placed as the settler in charge of the ancient heart. They upgrade the carrying capacity of all other settlers by 5, which is a considerable boost and helps speed up resource transportation and your economy. I don't, however, agree with his second advice about using resources to unlock species-specific housing in the Smoldering City, but this does depend on the difficulty on which you play, as in higher difficulties this becomes more useful. He does make a good point about how this reduces the number of buildings in the blueprint pool, as you have already unlocked these homes and you get more opportunities to choose something else. Another of his advice about the different species is that if you have lizards in your settlement, which have notoriously low resolve at the start, you can boost it by using the species resolve interface at the top left of the screen during times you have the most problems with them, which is the storm season. This is quite delicate as it reduces the resolve of other species in the settlement, and I must admit only once trying to use it and the attempt ended badly for me, so use it with caution. I have already dedicated a whole video to explaining resolve and how to keep it high, and it is linked up here on the right and down in the description. Martin Blake also left a wealth of tips and advice for us in the comments of my previous videos, which I invite you to do yourself, and these are just some of them as I have already covered others in my previous videos. First one is about opening and completing glades one at a time and not overstretching yourself, your resources and your settlers. As you know, each forgotten or dangerous glade can have multiple events which require settlers and resources to be solved, and therefore opening one at a time is a very good advice. Keeping a supply of about 6 to 10 tools in the early game and 15 plus in the late game is very important for solving these events quickly. His next advice is about keeping a certain quantity of amber handy, as this way you can reroll building blueprints multiple times once you have unlocked that option in the Smoldering City. Also, when you do choose new building blueprints, prioritize the ones that can boost settlers' resolve over those that provide new resources or more efficient production, similar to what Griswold 7 Slicer has advised in one of the tips from the beginning of this video. TheRealXartaX has some good tips about Against the Storm for us as well. First of these is that if you play on some of the highest and hardest difficulty settings, you only receive more XP points and not more resources to upgrade the Smoldering City. So keep that in consideration when looking for a challenge. This advice is important and should be considered along with the advice from Stelu Hututui and DERP MASTER. The TheRealXartaX also points out that you should keep in mind that while beavers help with woodcutting as they have a chance to double the yield, they are even better as miners who work in a coal mine, as coal lasts longer in the ancient heart and is also worth much more than wood in trade. So using them as miners instead of woodcutters lets you upgrade your economy, especially as raw wood is more common as a crafting recipe ingredient than coal. Next, we have advice from Dodang_914 about possible production chain setups which help you win. For example, he suggests keeping a lot of humans around, boosting the resolve as it is the easiest one to keep high. You should have them work in farms, herb gardens and especially plantations. That is where they produce both berries for simple food and fiber for cloth. In these farming workplaces, they boost your production and provide good ingredients for complex foods and other goods. On top of that, he advises on making sure you have some production of crystallized bars or copper bars so you can use them in the carpenter building to produce tools. Tools, which I explained, are one of the most important resources for solving glade events. Now, interestingly enough, Niko Paseman doesn't agree with Dodang_914 about humans being easy to please as they have the highest threshold for happiness, while lizards and harpies, for example, have lower thresholds, but they do also suffer from very low starting resolve. This is offset by the fact that you can boost their resolve quickly in specific workplaces matching their specialization, and that insects, eggs and meat can be found or grown in many biomes for their complex food needs. Here, Dodang_914 countered by explaining that in late game and with many unlocks in the Smoldering City, including special homes, humans become the support species because of their great farming bonus. This bonus lets you grow a lot of different food ingredients and then complex food out of these. On top of that, the production chain of the plantations, weavers, along with a carpenter or lumber mill, then cooperage or brick house, and lastly an alchemist hut with a scribe, gets you many services necessary to boost both human and beaver resolve rather high. Combine this with a few lucky cornerstone picks and you have strong production and services which will get you through the hardest of storm seasons. Thank you for the tips and watching this video. Use the cards for more gameplay advice and happy gaming.